So hi everyone who's here already. Thanks so much for coming to tonight's Shining a Light lecture. We're just going to give it a few minutes as more people are trickling in and we'll get started. Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, which is one of our Shining Light lecture series. This one tonight is entitled Graphic and Multimedia Narratives in Connecticut's Asian American History, a review of the Cargo Rebellion, Those Who Chose Freedom, with Dr. Jason Chang. My name is Olivia Luntz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second Shining a Light lecture in the series this spring, which is dedicated to elevating and amplifying underrepresented voices in local history in order to highlight the stories, research, and people who are dedicated to interpreting, restoring, and preserving those histories. Funding for this project is made possible by the state of Connecticut and the National Endowment for the Humanities, both of which provide significant support to Connecticut humanities. Tonight's lecture will highlight Dr. Chang's collaborative research and publication of a graphic and animated history of Connecticut's connection to the trade in indentured Asian workers, as well as updates on the state's K-12 Asian American Studies curriculum. Tonight's event will run until 7:15 and will consist of a presentation followed by a moderated question and answer. So please feel free to drop your questions as they come up throughout the presentation in the Q&A feature that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, this program will be recorded and will be available for further viewing on our website following the event's conclusion tonight. It is my pleasure to tell you a bit about our guest for the evening, Dr. Jason Chang. So Jason Oliver Chang is an associate professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut, where he also serves as the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. As a public servant, he sits on the Governor's Hate Crimes Advisory Council, and he is the co-founder of a grassroots organization advocating for Asian American and Pacific Islander study education reform in K-12 public schools. So without further ado, I'll pass things over to Dr. Chang, and we're super excited for your presentation.
Wow, Olivia, thank you so much for your support in the program, for that warm introduction. And to Maggie, who's Maggie Dimak, who has been a partner in this work, as well as other partnerships with the Greenwich Historical Society. This has been a really important public partner in thinking about our collective past and making history live again in various ways. We're partners in an oral history project with the South Asian American community, and we've done 2 years of a oral history project called My Story, Our Future, where we train middle school and high school South Asian American students to conduct oral histories with their parents and grandparents. And so, while we're really excited to think about the past and to think about the Connecticut's Asian American past, a lot of it remains unwritten. And so these kinds of projects supported by the Greenwich Historical Society are just vital to doing that work. So I'm super grateful for this opportunity to share with you the research that we've done here in Connecticut, and what does an Asian American studies curriculum in public schools look like? I want to share with you a module that we've created that is the centerpiece is this comic book we wrote. And so I want to share that material with you. I want to share the comic book itself. And then we also have a clip that I want to play for you where we turned the comic book into an animated short. And so we did this with student participation at UConn, and with the involvement of different artists to help make this a really rich learning experience that's also really entertaining. So that's my plan. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we came to this project. And then I want to share with you the resources of the background, and the actual text of the comic. And I have some interdisciplinary pieces of history to kind of wrestle with to show the complexity and the richness of this story. And then we'll end with the video clip. And I'm really excited for the Q&A to really be in dialogue with you all. Uh, so, um, so this project to write The Cargo Rebellion. That's this book here. It's with PM Press. This took 3 years of collaborative writing and sketching and getting the images just right, and copy editing everything. But it really rests on 10 years of research that have been done by myself, Alexis Dudden, my co-author, is also my colleague in the UConn's history department, as well as Benjamin Barson, who's a musician and scholar and professor at Bucknell University. And so this work really is, even though we're talking about maybe 25 to 30 pages here, this really represents a really deep kind of research endeavor that we hope will just reach the hearts and minds of a lot of different folks. And so, for me, my research on this area really started with looking at the Asian diasporas in Latin America. And my first book was on anti-Chinese politics in Mexico from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, really looking at the impact that anti-Chinese politics had in Mexico during the revolution. So that sparked my interest in looking at Asian diasporas elsewhere, including, predominantly Cuba and Peru. These were two places that had incorporated indentured Asian workers as replacements for the emancipated African slaves in the middle of the 19th century. And this was at the time when I was doing my research, this wasn't a really well understood chapter history. And so it in my pursuit of thinking through, what does the Asian diaspora in Latin America tell us, I had to go, look at research in different ocean, from different parts of the world, from the Atlantic and Caribbean world to the Pacific, and really thinking about this transition from the African slave trade in the Atlantic to the trade in indentured Asian workers in the Pacific. And how did that transfer happen? Who was involved? How do we get, uh, how were those connections made, and what was life like in those spaces? And so this also led me to thinking about sailors in new ways. Like, if you know anything about immigration history for the United States, we pretty much start the story after they get off the boat, right? And I began to think, well, what about the sailors themselves? Were they not, there must have been sailors before there were immigrants. And so when I started exploring that question, it really opened up the interesting elements of port culture in Asia, particularly Hong Kong, Macau, and these other port cities in China, including the Manila in the Philippines, and Chittagong in Bangladesh, present day Bangladesh. And so these were all spaces where I was observing and seeing how different imperial fleets were bringing in Asian workers to work on boats, and those workers were then becoming some of the first immigrants. And so this, for me, the questions of maritime history, of diasporas, of empire and slavery were really important to kind of unraveling different aspects of Asian American history. You don't normally think of those things as being sort of intertwined. Um, and and so when my colleague Alexis Dudden came to me with the story of the Robert Bone Mutiny, and I was like, well, this is such a fascinating story. This is amazing. And she was like, well, I don't want this to just be a footnote in my next book. I want this to be a really, important story because this is sort of the Amistad of the Pacific. Um, and so we began to think, well, okay, this is, really a combination of both of our research interests. Um, you know, this was a really exciting opportunity to build, a what we were thinking of as like 21st century scholarship, something that really combines interdisciplinary work for multiple audiences. It really comes from strong scholarly research. Um, so I had also at the time just invited Ben to be an artist in residence at the Institute at UConn. And Ben, as an artist and scholar, was also really excited about this opportunity. So we began working together and putting a story together that um, that that connected the life of a New Haven sea captain, um, and his adventure in traveling to China to recruit workers onto his vessel to then sell them as contracted workers to guano producers in Peru. But he lied to his the passengers, said, I'm going to take you to California, right? And once they discovered that they were not on the right course for California, they mutinied, and they killed the captain, and they took control of the boat. And it was at that time that a typhoon hit and shipwrecked the vessel in Japanese islands and Japanese waters. And then that's when the drama really unfolds, because now the question is, what is the fate of these workers? Um, are they the legal cargo of a U.S. ship? Are they immigrants stranded on a Japanese island? Um, are they Chinese workers who've been kidnapped? These were the legal questions being asked at the time, and it sparked one of the first international maritime crises with modern maritime law in the South China Sea. And so that question over the fate of these workers was strikingly similar to the mutineers in the La Amistad that also was, landed here in Connecticut. And so that question over the personhood of slaves was strikingly similar 13 years later in the Pacific. And so when we take this as a really provocation to one, say th this mutiny that happened in the Pacific is also a Connecticut story, right? That this is linked in the Robert Bone ship was not the only ship from Connecticut to transport indentured Asian workers. Um, and so this also became a really important point for me as a historian of Asian American. I teach Asian American studies. And most of the time, when you read about Asian American history, it kind of starts with the gold rush and railroad workers coming from China, recruited to build infrastructure and to mine the mineral resources of the American West. Um, and what this story really highlights is that even before the gold rush and before the recruitment of railroad workers, so we see that indentured Asian workers were a were a part of a plantation economy. They were a part of an international or global circulation of of workers for different kinds of labor, whether it was for sugarcane or guano extraction. And there was even an experiment of using indentured Asian workers in cotton fields in Louisiana. And so this idea that indentured Asian workers were a suitable replacement for enslaved Africans is an important place to start a conversation about Asian American history, and that doesn't often get situated properly when we think about gold rushers or railroad workers, right? So for me, this is a really great way to kind of introduce Asian American history to a new generation through a comic book, through really interesting and situated primary sources based here in Connecticut that that Asian American history can start right here in Connecticut. And as a scholar, as someone who's been working in Asian American studies for more than 20 years now, there is a group of scholars that we get together and we call that's a caucus in the Association for Asian American Studies called East of California, because so much of Asian American history is situated on the West Coast, but where everything is really built different on in other parts of the country when it comes to Asian American history. So that's where I really found such a great um, uh, uh, purchase for thinking about what could a curriculum, an Asian American Studies curriculum in Connecticut look like. Um, and so I think I want to sort of pivot the conversation now, um, and really turn towards the actual text so you can see what this comic book looks like. And then I want to then come back to some of the curricular resources that we've collected to support learning around this issue. And then I'll turn to the video clip. Okay. Uh, so let me share my screen. All right. Is that coming through okay, Olivia? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. All right. So this is the Cargo Rebellion, those who chose freedom. Now, I want to just make a shout out to my mentor and the founding director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, Roger Buckley. So this book is dedicated to him. Here we can see the dedication page. Um, Roger was also a historian here at UConn. My colleague, he helped hire me. I owe him a debt of gratitude. But he wrote a trilogy of novels about um, um, uh, different folks in the British Empire who rebelled against colonial rule. And so the name of that trilogy is Those Who Chose Freedom. And so when we were thinking about naming this and dedicating it to Roger, that trilogy title really resonated with, I think, the larger kind of extended story of anti-colonial rebellion, which the United States is a part of, to many other freedom struggles that go on today. Right. So for me, that's just an important shout out to Roger, and it brings me so much joy to have him represented here in this text. He was such an advocate of the arts too, that being able to express this work through the medium of visual culture and comic art and now also animation is, I think he would be very happy to see this. So we first start with an invocation, saying, "How many who fought against indenture and bondage are buried at sea? Not all who rebel are remembered," right? And that this was sort of a recognition that that the story of the Robert Bone Mutiny was not really well understood for a very long time. We were able to find several reports on it, but they're very fragmented and partial, and the historical record about this mutiny is really scattered across different continents and different imperial archives. So as we begin the story, we wanted to also include other mutinies in the so-called coolie trade. Coolies was the name that was given to these indentured Asian workers. That category really defined these Asian workers as desirable but also disposable. And so that term coolie really kind of encapsulates that that sort of racial idea of who these people were. And so we made this list here of the predominant, uh, mutinies that happened during this same period, uh, from beginning in 1850 here and all the way into 1872. And this wasn't by any means an exhaustive list, but these were ones that we knew we had records of, right? And so we set the stage by trying to understand that these conflicts um, around the racial limits of citizenship, the slave trade, and freedom movements were something that people in Connecticut were already familiar with at the time because of the La Amistad case and because of revolutions that were happening continuously throughout the mid 19th century. Um, and and so we bring this home to Connecticut, right, by looking um, at how a New Haven captain saw an opportunity a very lucrative opportunity to transport workers from China to the guano fields of the islands off of Peru. So we've depicted these two scenes here. One, this kind of international labor circuitry where Asian workers were being redistributed to cover some of the labor demands that were created after the emancipation of enslaved Africans around the 1830s. Right. And then we have another page here depicting the guano fields and how deadly they were for the workers there. We're able to really use this beautiful artwork and these images. The color scheme here is just so evocative and simple too. So I've actually failed to mention that this is the artwork of Kim Inthavong, who is just such a talented illustrator. I mean, you will see that this form of artistry really brings the story to life. And she was so awesome to work with as a historian and working with, trying to pass along some historically accurate details about ships, about the ports, um, the names for places, terminology, and just really getting a really thick sense of the past was so much fun to work with Kim and to generate these images. Um, so we have the ship. Here is where we're able to depict the mutiny, and and we wanted to show the conflict, but at the same time, we knew that we didn't want to kind of fetishize the violence, or we didn't want to make the violence really like the centerpiece of it, but we did need to show that the conflict did happen. And so and so this was our opportunity. We had really long debates over how to depict this scene. And I think what comes across though is that that lives were at stake and that people were being forced into very terrible conditions. And so the mutiny here is meant to tell that important story, and that when we do that, we're able to put into context the stakes of both, what it was like to kidnap hundreds of people and force them onto a boat and then travel for weeks on end at sea to take them to a place they didn't want to go to, right? That meant probably certain death, right? To work in these guano fields. Um, and so after the mutiny, we see that the ship, if we think in the timeline, while um, while the Robert Bone is on its way to China to pick up these workers, pick up their cargo, there is a storm brewing, right? And a typhoon is on its way to to the Chinese coast. And immediately after the mutiny, this typhoon hits and and basically destroys the boat, and it's shipwrecked on the Yanayama Islands in Japan, in Japanese waters. And here we depict how how the workers uh, left the boat, tried to get to the island, and then were hunted down by British officers. Once the mutiny was reported and they were identified, it led to a kind of a manhunt on the island. And that's when some of them were captured. That's when we begin to depict the international drama that unfolded, right? And so we're able to show here the kinds of legal arguments that were being made. That on the one hand, the Americans were saying that Bryson was killed by his laborers, and the Chinese diplomat, on the other hand, Qing official, uh, is saying, well, are coolies not men like you and I? You don't have the authority to enslave these people, right? So was the crime the murder, or was the crime the kidnapping, right? So so this led to a lot of consternation and really different powers trying to assert their authority on the issue because it was in international waters, and it was the the shipwreck was uh, on in the territory of in which none of the parties of the Robert Bone Mutiny were their home territory. It involved other folks too. So the fate of these workers became the subject of international debate to see who could win the day on this. And I mean, the story goes that these workers, that none of the legal arguments really stuck for anyone, and it shows the complexity of this period, but then also that the mutineers ended up in lots of different places. So there wasn't really like one story that could be told about how this event unfolded over time. And we end by looking at this memorial that was built on the Yanayama Island, in dedication to the mutineers who had shipwrecked on that island. The residents of the island helped to care for them after they arrived, and this is the only monument in the world to these workers, to the folks who perished there. So not back in China, not in any of the places where they were incarcerated later. For those that were incarcerated, that this was, in some ways, a lasting, kind of memorial that still stands today. We can go and visit that if you're able to make your way to the Yanayama Islands. But we thought this was such a beautiful way to kind of end the story, and by bringing into focus that human trafficking, which the story of the cargo rebellion is a story of human trafficking, is still a problem today. That human trafficking is still something that we deal with even in Connecticut. During the pandemic, we saw a spike in human trafficking in the East Coast, and and that this is still a major problem. And so by telling this story, we really hoped to, one, uh, shift the narrative, shift the starting point for Asian American studies or Asian American history, particularly for Connecticut. Um, and then two, we wanted to highlight that the story that this history illuminates is a common story that is still with us today. So that we felt like this was a really wonderful, invocation to open the lessons of uh, these. Um, I'm so sorry. Twins are um, sending me several messages. It's inappropriate at this moment, so apologize for that. Um, let's see. So this is, really just a labor of love to do this with such an awesome team, right? And so um, being able to tell this story in this way has been,
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
I'm so sorry. So I'm going to stop sharing. Um, and what I want to do next is to share with you some of the pieces, some of the interdisciplinary pieces of the lesson that we built for eighth grade folks. And let me see if I can bring this up here. Okay. All right, so here we see, so this is a Teach It module with the Connecticut CT Humanities, and built this eighth grade lesson with my student, Karen Lau. And what we have here is, a little bit of setup to understand the situation. And one of the enduring or compelling questions here is, how have American conceptions of freedom and equality changed throughout U.S. history for members of various racial, ethnic, religious, gender minority groups? And this is a key inquiry question across eighth grades. Across the country from a very common, inquiry-based curriculum. And so we use this as the sort of starting point that this story, the Cargo Rebellion, really helps to tell a different picture here. And so we have some supporting questions, right? What was the Asian coolie trade? In what ways was the Asian coolie trade similar to and different from the transatlantic slave trade? Right? These are all questions that we provide, the students with in the beginning, so that as they read, as they go through and digest some of this material, that they begin to answer the question for themselves. And so here we have, this links to an article that's the first reporting of the Robert Bone Mutiny. Here we have an example of, I think this is the Hound, which is a vessel that was built in Mystic, Connecticut, and made several voyages transporting indentured Asian workers to the Caribbean from China. So we see this as a really, consistent piece of Connecticut's history, is to being involved in this. And if we just looked at Asian American history and said, well, it just starts with railroad workers and gold rushers, we would never ask that question about the East Coast, right? So I think this is a really great way to kind of unravel the past, and to draw from its really rich connections. Next is a data story. And this was a really fun project for me to work on, because I used already published data that had been in, in an index in a well-known research text for decades. Um, and I took that data. I had some graduate students at UConn help me process it, put it into a spreadsheet. And then we use this really wonderfully powerful, sophisticated data analytic tools to tell this amazing story about about the history of the trade in indentured Asian workers. And so the first thing I want to share with you is this sort of animated map that we made that connected the origin and destination point of the registered coolie trade vessels. And they're not all of the coolie trade vessels were registered, but this record, this list of records is a pretty good, almost near complete record of those that were registered. So what you'll see is from uh, from 1847 to 1874, you will see orange lines here depicting this transit, right, from the Chinese ports to destinations where the indentured Asian workers were taken. And each year is the number of voyages. The number of voyages is represented with the how dark the line is. So the redder the line, the more voyages, right? So if it's more of orange, it's sort of fewer. So this gives you a sense of what this looked like over the course of this period, 1847, 1874, right? So let me just play this and let it run its course. Right. So when I share this with students, they really see an amazing kind of picture that is evolving, and we see this continuous, sort of transportation of workers from China to all these locations across Latin America. So this is a really great starting point to understand the number of uh, of indentured Asian workers, right? And so we look at this, and this is for when I teach this is a really great way to show the impact that the Civil War had on this trade. And what we see is that we see this dip right here in 1862, right? And so we see that the Civil War brings this, punctuation uh, to to the trade in indentured Asian workers. And this is also a moment where President Lincoln bans the American participation in the trade in indentured Asian workers because importing Asian workers was, to him and his colleagues, too similar to slavery. And that association meant um, that the U.S. should no longer participate in that. So this period here is the end of U.S. involvement. 1862 is the end of U.S. involvement, but it doesn't actually end the trade, at all. We actually see in the rebound from that twice as many the following years, right? Um, so we need to understand this a little bit better, right? So the data actually allows us to show that the participation of different vessels um, in transporting indentured Asian workers is, the composition of vessels really tells also an important story, right? So the US is here in orange, right? So we see the US participation. In some ways, it roughly accounts for, a quarter to a third, sometimes half of, of the trade, right? So when they drop out, though, we see all these other players picking up the sort of, we could say, the market share of indentured Asian workers that were being transported, right? And then we can shift the data again to say, okay, well, what were the destinations of these workers, right? And so we see here, Cuba is in red, and Peru is in this kind of yellowish green here. British Guiana is here in peach, and Suriname in light blue, and Trinidad here in the gray, right? So we see these Caribbean, South American, and locations as the destination uh, for these workers. And Cuba is primarily sugar plantations, whereas Peru is largely the guano fields, right? So this is understanding that piece of the puzzle, of how many people were transported is an important, way to understand the scale and the scope of this trade in Asian workers. But in that scale and scope, it's also important to get a sense of how deadly this trade was. And through the data that we compiled, we're able to calculate the death rate according to the flag of ship. And so what we see here is that Peruvian ships were the deadliest ships to travel across the Pacific in. This figure shows 20% of workers who were transported from China on Peruvian ships perished at sea. French vessels were next, British, Spanish, and US vessels here, Italian, Salvadoran, Portuguese, right? So these are not good numbers. This was a very tragic result of their treatment and of the manner in which they were transported. It's worth noting that that despite these losses, despite the knowledge that these patterns of these mortality rates were known by captains, the trade continued, right? They knew that it was deadly, but they continued to do this, right? And one of the mechanisms that allowed them to financially endure these kinds of losses was that ship captains would often take out insurance policies on their voyages. And at this time, one of the key places to purchase these maritime insurance policies on human cargo was in Connecticut. The insurance industry here did insure, slave transportation in the Atlantic, as well as indentured Asian workers in the Pacific. And so the insurance around these kinds of voyages actually allowed it to persist as a deadly practice. And so that's a really interesting way to kind of think about, okay, wow, what were the enduring kind of consequences of this? And another way to slice the data to make the story even more rich is to look at the destination, right? The number of indentured Asian workers that arrived at their destination and the vessels that brought them there, right? So we see here, this data shows the destination of Cuba as the total overall delivery of workers as the most, with Peru second. And then the number of deaths on those vessels by the flag of ship, right? So we see there's more deaths that the destination of Cuba was the deadliest destination, in part because it was the longest, right? They had to go all the way around South America, right? So that death rate is connected to the actual route and the length of the voyage, right? So these are, what we're trying to do with this research is to paint a really, you know, interdisciplinary picture. One, we have narratives, we have illustrations, we have newspaper reporting, and now a data picture to really describe the scale and scope and detail of what this trade looked like and why a ship captain in New Haven might embark on an enterprise such as this. Um, and another fascinating piece of Connecticut history is we also have this anonymous journal I found in the state archives and let me see if I can blow it up a little bit. So I don't know if you can make this out. I had a really hard time translating this, and I had another graduate student help me transcribe this. Um, but this is an anonymous journal written by someone in Connecticut who went to Cuba and interviewed former indentured Asian workers in Cuba in 1913 and 1914, right? So this is decades after their arrival in Cuba, and they're still working in very similar conditions that they were when they arrived. And so this is such a fascinating piece of history that is here in Connecticut. And so you might be asking, why Connecticut? What happened here? Um, and to answer that question, we get to learn more about the story of Young Wing. And Young Wing is um, the first Asian American to graduate from an institution of higher education in the United States. I graduated from Yale, and he was a student. It was a part of a missionary program, and he enjoyed his time here so much and thought that international, intercultural education was so valuable that he created the Chinese Educational Mission, which brought dozens of students from China to study in Hartford. And and those students went on to become the diplomats and engineers and many of the leaders of China's industrial period because of this kind of international education, this transcultural environment. And one of the other things that Young Wing did in his amazing life is he was recruited by the Qing government to investigate the the abuse of Chinese workers in Cuba. As someone fluent in English, already working in the United States, fluent in Chinese, and who could help to organize this investigation, he became a central figure in exposing the abuses of the so-called coolie system. And so he had proteges here in Connecticut who followed that work. And so in addition to this being a story about the participation of people in Connecticut in the slave trade and in the trade in indentured Asian workers, it's also a story about the struggle for abolition and that Connecticut played, people in Connecticut played a crucial role in stopping the trade in indentured Asian workers, and calling out its abuses. And thanks to Young Wing's work in the commission and in the Cuba Commission, the coolie system, as it was called, was shut down, right? And so what this journal is likely, a result of is one of his students probably followed the trail of his teacher, went back to Cuba, interviewed more workers in the same fashion that he had done during the original Cuba Commission report, and to report on the legacy and the continued abuses that these folks were experiencing. So I just find this to be a fascinating piece of Connecticut history that really illuminates such an important chapter, really for global history, to understand many of these larger struggles. Um, so these are the kinds of resources that we want to surround students with, as they encounter this story through the visual medium. We want to give them the primary sources and the context to understand it. And um, and then we made an animated short based on this comic book. And I'd like to play a clip for you so you can kind of get a sense of how the students in my class got really inspired by this, and they wanted to lend their voice talent to narrating the story, and to see Kim's illustrations really come to life. This artistry is really to our other team member, Adam Cooper Turan, who is an incredible video and multimedia artist. And so really you're seeing his magic working here. So let me pause for a moment and see if I can get all of the buttons right on this. All right. Are you able to see that, Lydia? Yeah, okay, cool.
In 1852.
410 coolies mutinied aboard the Portuguese ship Adamastor in 1853.
350 coolies mutinied aboard Captain Jimana's Dutch ship Banca in 1856.
240 coolies mutinied aboard Captain Carignag's French ship Anais in 1857.
850 coolies mutinied aboard Captain Johnson's U.S. ship Flora Temple in 1859.
588 coolies mutinied aboard the Spanish ship Encarnacion in 1861.
715 coolies mutinied aboard the French ship Caroline in 1865.
906 coolies mutinied aboard Captain Giraud's French ship Eugene Adele in 1866.
462 coolies mutinied aboard Captain Chapeau's French ship Bangkok in 1867.
400 coolies mutinied aboard Captain Bryson's U.S. ship Robert Bone in 1852.
How many who fought against indenture and bondage are buried at sea?
Not all who rebel are remembered.
The sea is vast and cares not for humanity.
However, we are connected, not by blood, but by this water.
And we choose to remember.
The story of the Robert Bone Mutiny shows the struggle of indentured Chinese men against American capitalism and a global economy which profited from their death and expendability.
Transatlantic slavery filled global commerce for centuries, creating enormous wealth and geographies of brutality across the Americas, where life expectancy averaged 10 to 15 years.
By the 1830s, more than 2 million enslaved Africans lived in the U.S. Several events helped make enslavement of Africans too politically costly.
First, the Haitian Revolution, ending in 1804, in which more than 100,000 enslaved people rose up against their masters and claimed the island for themselves.
Later in 1839, the Amistad Mutiny helped illustrate the brutality of human cargo and the ongoing suffering of enslaved people, even though the slave trade had been outlawed in the United States in 1808.
A cargo of Africans committed mutiny on the Spanish ship La Amistad en route to Cuba.
The ship was apprehended off Long Island.
Mutineers were held in New Haven, Connecticut.
judicial proceedings centered on the status of people as property.
The court sided with Sangbei Pie, signaling a change in U.S. attitudes.
Although a mile marker in the struggle for abolition, U.S. versus law Amistad was not the final word.
American officials and plantation interests worried about how their agricultural system would survive without their human property. In this quandary, Americans turned to the British indentured system of the Pacific.
While La Amistad's mutineers won, a strikingly similar question would arise 13 years later in the Pacific, with Chinese people as cargo who chose to rebel.
The plantation owners around the world were in dire need for exploitable labor, as the British abolished their slave trade in 1833. Coolies were transported to plantations across the Pacific and Atlantic worlds. Including the US, hundreds of Americans were involved in the coolie trade as they fueled their overseas businesses and intensified the industrialization of an expanding American capitalist empire.
The so-called coolie trade was a massive international pipeline to transport hundreds of thousands of Chinese and South Asians who were contracted as indentured servants in exchange for wages. Even though they signed contracts, these were often broken by unscrupulous captains.
Many Chinese coolies were more or less forced into these contracts due to outstanding debt and kidnapping. The First Opium War, waged by the British Navy, forced China to permit the massive importation of opium into China and ceded Hong Kong to British rule. It also legitimized the coolie trade.
Coolie labor contracted in Xiamen had many destinations: Cuba, Panama, Louisiana, Hawaii, British Guiana, California.
The most feared location was the Chincha Islands in Peru. For thousands of years, the excrement from seabirds piled upon those islands, producing an extremely valuable agricultural fertilizer known as guano.
It was as valuable as it was dangerous. The ammonia clouds produced by this bird dung killed tens of thousands of workers, and more than 2/3 died.
The year, 1852. A Connecticut businessman by the name of Leslie Bryson sets out with his ship, the Robert Bone.
His destination, Amoy, known today as Xiamen, China.
He made the journey not to seek fame or fortune, nor to start a new life, but to seek a very specific bounty, the profits of shipping 400 Chinese coolie laborers.
The laborers contracted by Bryson were told they would be going to San Francisco. As days passed by, rumors spread on the boat that Bryson was lying, that their real destination was the dreaded Chincha Islands. The 400 workers made a pact. They would not be taken there by any means necessary.
One day, Bryson cut off the queues or braided hair of the workers to break their spirits, and it was a tipping point as it broke Chinese imperial law.
The laborers rose up and killed Captain Bryson.
The mutineers attempted to sail back to China, but their boat hit a coral reef near Ishigaki Island in the East China Sea, part of the Ryukyu Kingdom and closer to China than Japan.
They were forced to breach in the Yaeyama Islands.
Mutineers who survived the swim ashore had to contend with poisonous snakes and eventually being hunted by British forces set on apprehending them. Some mutineers were captured and returned to Chinese shores as prisoners. Some mutineers returned to their former lives on the coasts.
So I wanted to stop there because it's 7 o'clock and I wanted to save some time. as much as I would love to share the rest of it with you, I'm also really excited to hear your questions and dialogue. So, Livy, this is that's where I think I'll stop. And if you have any questions, love to get that started.
Okay. One thing I'll say first, because I'm so invested in seeing the end of the video, do you think you could share with me a link and then I could send an email to everyone who is here tonight, a link to the rest of the video so they can watch it? Is that be possible?
I'm working on a way to share it through Vimeo. Once we have that set up, I will absolutely share the link with you.
Be on the lookout. I will, whenever I get access to it, I will share it with everyone. Okay, so thanks to everyone who already sent in some questions. The Q&A box is still open if anyone, is marinating on some thoughts and wants to ask Dr. Chang anything. I should also say thank you so much for your engaging in such an interesting presentation. You touched on so many topics in a short period of time. Really, really interesting. So Maggie is wondering a bit about, do you have any plans to share this graphic novel with young audiences in Connecticut or elsewhere? What's in the works?
Yeah, so this text is a part of that CT Humanities Teach It module. It's really directed at 8th grade, but it could be scaled up or scaled back, to different grades. This is also a part of the curriculum that we're sharing with high school teachers. And there's a program in Connecticut called the Early College Experience Program out of UConn, and it allows us to sort of deputize high school teachers to teach UConn classes as dual credit high school classes. And so one of the things we're doing right now is we're training high school teachers to teach Intro to Asian American Studies in the high schools, which helps to satisfy the Asian American Studies, the API inclusion mandate that will go into effect in 2025. And it also prepares students to be able to continue that learning once they start at UConn. So it's a wonderful program, and we're sharing these texts, these kinds of mentor texts with the teachers, and so that they can begin to incorporate these kinds of graphic histories. Or there's graphic memoirs, graphic novels, and graphic history, I think, is also another really interesting way to engage with students in the 21st century. So those are some of our plans. And once we get the streaming link for Vimeo set up, we hope it will reach even broader audiences too.
Amazing. Similar to that, Karen is wondering where the book is available to purchase.
Yeah, you can go to PM Press. PM Press, I think it's pmpress.org. Maybe someone could check that for me.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, I have, let's see. Oh yeah, pmpress.org. I have their sticker right here. So yes, you can purchase it there. It is a hardback book. You can also purchase it in ebook version, and so those are just available from the press. They're located in Ithaca, New York. So actually, I purchased another set of texts, and they came in 2 days. So very, very quick shipping.
Marianne is wondering about what is the current requirement for K through 8th grade in the area of Asian American studies, and I'm wondering myself, how is that changing in the coming years?
Yeah, so before our efforts to change Connecticut's education statutes, it was pretty rare to have any mention of Asian Americans in public education. It depended on your teacher, on the school, on the district, but for the most part, Asian Americans were largely absent. And you could see that in textbooks, maybe just a mention, a little pop-out story about one or two features. The most common lesson on Asian American history taught in the US is on Japanese American incarceration during World War II. So that's the most common lesson taught, but frequently it's the only one taught. So we know that that's completely insufficient. And I mean, it's the 21st century now that these kinds of oversights and limited kinds of understandings of U.S. history really need to be changed. So when we embarked on that campaign to change education statutes, we really, turned to the students today, to high school students, and said, what is it like to be an Asian American kid in Connecticut? What is it like to, you know, to be to learn Asian American to learn U.S. history and not see yourself or your community or Asian American other people that might look like you represented in that history. And their stories of invisibility and alienation really were just so compelling to legislators. We helped to organize parents, we helped to organize teachers and students, and just give them the opportunity to share their story. And I should say that, really this kind of also came out of the context of the surge in anti-Asian racism during the pandemic. And for the youth today, that was a real wake-up call. And that the invisibility and the absence in the absence in cultural representation, in historical representation, had they were seeing political consequences. They were seeing that their invisibility was also kind of a symptom of the vulnerability that they were experiencing. And so those things working together really, I think, kind of created special conditions here in Connecticut where thanks to the youth, thanks to this, so many different, organizations from API New Haven to API Westport, these groups of families and just different Asian American communities across the state just really chimed in and stood together, saying that this is what we want education in Connecticut to look like. And now Connecticut has the most inclusive education statutes in any other state. It is pretty remarkable, but the State Department of Education can't do it on its own. And we are a home rule state, which means that while there can be mandates and statutory regulations over education, it's really up to districts to decide how to implement that. Right. So that could mean that there's 172 variations of this in Connecticut. And we know that this is, that educational transformation is sort of like forever work. We will always be doing this. But we think this is an important way to get the conversation started and to, build new resources for children today, and to inspire them to ask different kinds of questions and to show that historical inquiry is not just about the facts. It's not just, but facts require interpretation, and that we need to be able to create, context for learning, and and help to share that joy of exploration and a really rich curiosity. And so the sort of governing ethos that I bring to this curriculum work is to think of what is a homegrown Asian American studies? What can we do here in Connecticut that's really specific to where we live? And so partners with like the Greenwich Historical Society, the Connecticut uh, uh, Museum for Culture and History, and other institutions around the state have just been vital partners to be able to scale up this work and to share it at such a scale that's appropriate to the demand for this, and to show that that really it's through partnership so we can really make this work happen, right?
And I think one last question for this evening. I've been wondering, how did you come to the decision that you wanted to convey this story about this cargo rebellion through a graphic novel, because this is such a fascinating, moment from history. There's so many different ways that you could have shown this, both I guess the graphic novel and then the animated piece as well, because I think that did an amazing job. But how did you come to that conclusion? Because it's not, I think, what most people would naturally gravitate towards.
Yeah, that's true. And it's also not something that scholars like myself typically do. Um, I think so. I have an arts background, and also as the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, I had that unit, that academic unit, has a history of featuring the arts. And when we look at Asian American history as a social movement, or Asian American studies as a social movement, it really began with artists and being able to tell compelling stories, be able to unite different understandings of the world. That often happens through art, through poetry, through paintings, through storytelling and performances, right? These are all really rich medium that have helped to bring people together. And I wanted to return to those roots, honestly. And so this was a perfect opportunity to do that. I mean, all the players were at the table. Alexis was there, Ben Barson was there, and Ben really brought together Kim Inthavong as the talent behind the illustration, and Adam Cooper Turan as this. Even though it worked on the final piece of the video, he was there with us in the design phases, because we knew that if we did the illustrations right, if we did it right where the image files could be separated, Adam could work with that after the comic was produced, and then be able to bring those different layers of the images to life. And really see that used in such an excellent way um, in this in the animated short. So once we got started, we knew that we had something special, because the story was one that, at this point, the historical record on indentured Asian workers did not have a really deep reservoir of materials. So how like the actual records that exist are sort of like ledgers or contracts, or there weren't like photographs, very many photographs, and this was a situation that was really trying to be there, that folks were trying to hide it from public view, right? So in the existence of a sort of sparse archival record, we knew that being able to sort of fill in the blanks and to use historical research and background to imagine richly and as accurately as possible what this space, what this story could have looked like, was a really, interesting uh, problem to try to wrestle with. And I think the end result is, it really sparks the imagination because it was such a hidden history. And so we used a lot of historical references from documentary photos to other depictions in different places, and said, well, it's probably similar, but this might have been different. The hair was this way in here, right? So we really try to, add as much detail to the images as possible. And as a story now, it stands as a representation of the erasures, to really fill in the gaps behind those things that for so many years had been hidden intentionally. So we thought making it actually visible and legible that way was an important kind of gesture, but then also important way to do the storytelling.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us, for joining us tonight, Jason. That was so interesting to learn about your work and also the changing curriculum happening here in Connecticut. We're so appreciative, and we thank everyone who joined us as well tonight for spending part of your evening with us. I just want to let everyone know that the next installment, which will also be the last installment for this spring of our Shining a Light lecture series, that is titled Reliquary of Blackness, Uncovering and Archiving the History of the Black Community in the Paper City with Erica Slocum, will take place on April 25th. So in a month from now at 6 p.m. And we hope to see all of you there. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of the night.
Thank you, everyone.